The title of my paper is The Meaning of a Story, Echoes of Psychoanalysis and Mimetic Desire in A View of the Woods. A mere 12 years after Flannery O'Connor's death, Dorothy Tuck McFarland noted that for the most part, quote, "For the most part, readers and critics alike have been unable to ignore O'Connor's view of the world, and many have found it an obstacle very difficult to circumnavigate successfully," unquote. That inability to ignore O'Connor's worldview has led many of her commentators to place their readings of her fiction squarely within the context of her life and beliefs. Given her complex but mostly negative perspective on Freud and psychoanalysis in general, many O'Connor scholars refuse to acknowledge the legitimacy of a psychoanalytic approach to stories such as A View of the Woods, as if O'Connor's skepticism towards the subject prohibits any attempt to interpret her work against the grain of her belief. Traditionalists have tended to ignore this story or pass over it quickly. This is unfortunate for two reasons. One, A View of the Woods is one of O'Connor's most Gothic stories, fraught with psychological horror and complexity. And two, because the psychoanalytic interpretation of the text beautifully illuminates that horror. Along with the orthodox psychoanalytic discourse, I want to advance a related theorist's ideas, those of René Girard. Girard himself writes in Violence and the Sacred that Freud's thought hinges on desire as much as his own, but that, quote, his mimetic intuitions are incompletely formulated, unquote. Girard then goes on to build upon what he considers Freud's most important ideas through his own theory of mimetic desire. If Girard has a relationship to the Freudian paradigm that he claims for himself, I should be able to utilize these two theories in tandem to conduct a reading of unique clarity and power of A View of the Woods. The story opens with the old man and his granddaughter, Mary Fortune, quote, watching the machine that lifted out dirt and threw it in a pile, unquote. The description of the machine doing its work in the story recalls the Freudian Fort da, while the description of Mary Fortune's absorption in watching the earth mover suggests her lack of mastery over the loss of the mother in the Lacanian sense, and her desire to master it through her own Fort da game. Quoting from the story, "The child did not have eyes for anything but the machine. She sat on the hood, looking down into the red pit, watching the big disembodied gullet gorge itself on the clay, then with the sound of deep sustained nausea and a slow mechanical revulsion, turn and spit it up. Her pale eyes behind her spectacles followed the repeated motion of it again and again, and her face, a small replica of the old man's, never lost its look of complete absorption." Pursuing this interpretation, we can see that the drama unfolding among the child, her grandfather, and her father is a game that she plays in order to master the loss of the mother. That loss which is symbolized in the story by the mother's namelessness. The child immerses herself in the imaginary, the realm of the mother, according to Lacan, by fixing her attention on the earth mover, having conversations with her feet, and valorizing the aesthetic in her defense of the woods against Fortune's plan to sell the lawn. This game is her attempt to subvert the symbolic order of the father and grandfather that she lives under. These motifs in the story, which lend themselves to psychoanalytic interpretation, are there for a reason, according to James Mellard, who writes, "For O'Connor, God is always the prescribed other/outra, towards which she consciously directs her thought and work, but there is an unacknowledged other, a figure of mirror stage identification and aggressivity, lurking in her fiction and commentary everywhere. The other of her unconscious is her unconscious, and its manifestation in her thought is its avatar and her other, Freud." In other words, Freud lurks behind these psychoanalytic echoes because O'Connor's unconscious mind couldn't escape his powerful and probing diagnosis, despite her conscious disavowal of his theories. Therefore, the family drama in A View of the Woods could be interpreted as a product of O'Connor's unconsciousness. An application of Girard's thought in interpreting this family drama presents a similar picture, though with telling differences. The relation among the three main characters, Fortune, Mary Fortune, and Pitts, can be read mimetically starting with their names. Fortune and his detested son-in-law Pitts are both named in the object of their desire, 9-year-old Mary Fortune Pitts. Fortune at first resists the idea of a Pitts being bestowed with the name of his beloved mother, but he relented when he saw that the child, quote, even at the age of 1 day, bore his unmistakable likeness, unquote. The two share an intimacy that he allows no one else. Yet the fact that Mary Fortune is a Pitts was something that makes him too insecure, despite their shared likeness. Quote, "The fact that Mary Fortune was a Pitts, too, was something he ignored in a gentlemanly fashion, as if it were an affliction the child was not responsible for. He liked to think of her as being thoroughly of his clay." Unquote. Mary Fortune, therefore, is Fortune's object of desire, and Pitts is his rival. Fortune's instinctual understanding of Pitts's power over the child is manifest in his obsequious gestures towards her, his refusal to whip her, his offer to start her a bank account, his dangling the possibility of a boat before her. His desire to master her increases even as he sees her loyalty to Pitts. Quote, "What was the matter with her that she couldn't stand up to Pitts? Why was there this one flaw in her character when he trained her so well in everything else? It was an ugly mystery." Unquote. Girard describes this behavior in a passage found early in his book, Deceit, Desire, and a Novel. Quote, "The ever-increasing price that the buyer is willing to pay is determined by the imaginary desire which he attributes to his rival. So there is indeed an imitation of this imaginary desire, and ever a very scrupulous imitation, since everything about the desire which is copied, including its intensity, depends upon the desire which serves as a model." Unquote. Every time Pitts gets up from the dinner table to drive Mary Fortune out to the woods to whip her, Fortune feels his grip on the object of his desire slipping, which necessitates his attempts to win her back. The desire of Pitts and his family to keep the lawn intact rests on a few simple things. Pitts grazes his calves there, the children play there, the family enjoys the view of the woods. Fortune does not understand their attachment to the, quote, "field of weeds," unquote. The family's attachment to the lawn strengthens his resolve to sell it, but while he claims for himself single-minded individualist will in all his business decisions, his behavior towards Mary Fortune becomes increasingly slavish as the story progresses. After he emerges from Tillman's to find that his granddaughter is left with Pitts, O'Conner gives us an amusing look at the distorting powers of mimetic desire. Quoting from the story, "A Negro boy drinking a purple drink was sitting on the ground with his back against the sweating ice cooler. 'Where did that little girl go to, boy?' he asked. 'I ain't seen ne'er a little girl,' the boy said. The old man irritably fished in his pocket and handed him a nickel and said, 'A pretty little girl in a yeller cotton dress.' 'If you speaking about a stout child look like you,' the boy said, 'she gone off in a truck with a white man.'" As the young man wittily demonstrates, Fortune is unable to see the reality that Mary Fortune is simply not an attractive child. When he finds her sitting on the porch swing staring at the woods, we are told he speaks to her almost as a lover. Quote, "He meant to make his voice severe, but instead it came out crushed, as if it belonged to a suitor trying to reinstate himself." In Lacanian terms, therefore, the story's drama develops from Fortune's mere stage identification with Mary Fortune. Mellor again makes this point. Quote, "A view of the woods pivots sharply on aspects of the mirror stage, on that is, the elements of narcissism. Through the old man, one sees that he and the girl are doubles, mirror images of each other," unquote. A sentence like, quote, "Pale identical eye looked into pale identical eye," unquote, practically screams for such a reading. Furthermore, the symbolic order of the father would seem to be responsible for the tension that Mary Fortune feels, the pull between her family, signified by Pitts, and herself, signified by her imaginary other. Fortune. Mellard's interpretation of the story, however, suffers on this account. As he writes, "O'Conner's description of the beating episodes make clear the structural relations among the points of the Oedipal triangle, Fortune, Pitts, and Mary Fortune, in, respectively, the structural places of subject, father figure, and mirror other." James Mellard is an excellent interpreter of O'Connor's thought, but here I think he's making his reading of the story a little too indebted to the most obscure aspects of Lacanian discourse. Let's instead look at the story with a Girardian angle. After Mary Fortune goes off in the pickup truck with Pitts, Fortune is left with his thoughts. Quote, "Pitts had ordered her to get in the truck, and she was afraid not to," unquote. We are also made aware of Fortune's considerable influence on her selective listening, her stubbornness, and her sullenness. So what Mary Fortune is experiencing is what Girard calls a, quote, "double bind," a contradictory double imperative, or rather a whole network of contradictory imperatives, unquote. He explains its operation further. "Man cannot respond to that universal human injunction, 'imitate me,' without almost immediately encountering an inexplicable counterorder, 'don't imitate me.' This second command fills man with despair and turns him into the slave of an involuntary tyrant. Man and his desires thus perpetually transmit contradictory signals to one another. The double bind is one of the areas in which Girard's thought is most indebted to psychoanalysis. Girard points out that psychoanalysis seems, quote, increasingly to the point as mimesis spreads and grows more acute, as destructuralization becomes more widespread and the double bind proliferates. The Oedipus complex waxes as the father wanes, unquote. The violence of the story's ending is presaged in this function, according to Girard, for violence follows close behind such a double bind. Quote, whenever he sees himself closest to the supreme goal, he comes into violent conflict with the rival. By a mental shortcut, he convinces himself that the violence itself is the most distinctive attribute of this supreme goal, unquote. The violence that Fortune has eschewed in his treatment of Mary Fortune comes to the fore towards the story's close. Quote, the child he had never lifted a hand to. Then he saw with the sudden vision that sometimes comes with delayed recognition that that had been his mistake. She respected Pitts because even with no just cause, he beat her. And if he, with his just cause, did not beat her now, he would have nobody to blame if she turned out a hellion. Fortune is obsessed with Pitt's beating of the child from the story's beginning to its end. When he is most upset, it seems to aggravate his heart condition, the very thing that eventually kills him. In this way, the jealousy and powerlessness he feels in the face of Pitt's severe discipline causes him to imitate Pitts at the story's close, with the faithful result that it brings about both Mary Fortune's and his own deaths. He becomes as centered on violence as Pitts appears to be. Bruce Gentry has remarked, quote, her father and grandfather reduced Mary Fortune Pitts into an abject child, without pride, probably without a sense of believing herself to have a self, unquote. It would be difficult to deny Gentry's assessment of Mary Fortune's plight. Mimetic desire shows the child's victimhood fully. The ending of this story has become notorious in O'Connor's studies, and few critics have found an adequate way of dealing with the shocking power of its violence. Millard's Lacanian interpretation of the ending actually deals quite nicely with its horror, as he writes, killing the child who is pure Pitts now, the old man kills not his mirroring, narcissistic, imaginary other, but his other in the register of the symbolic. And this is interesting. A far graver crime indeed, one that in psychoanalytic terms equals the murder of God and the Christian subject's denial of God's grace. I think that's fascinating analysis. Gentry's comment that, quote, there is no other work by O'Connor in which the murder victim is so thoroughly robbed of a soul, unquote, is also shockingly accurate. Yet, I suggest to fully appreciate the brutality of the ending, we turn to Girard's concept of scapegoating. Mary Fortune's sacrifice, if we may call it that, is dependent upon her threat to the entire community. For Fortune, that is not merely the family, who he does not actually care about, but his legacy. During an afternoon spent staring out his bedroom window, considering the woods, we discover his true design. Quote, he looked out the window at the moon shining over the woods across the road and listened for a while to the hum of crickets and tree frogs, and beneath their racket, he could hear the throb of the future town of Fortune, unquote. Pitts and the rest of the family do not present a threat to the existence of the town in Fortune's mind. It is only Mary Fortune who can effectively stand in the way. Her threat and Fortune's murder of her conform to Girard's comments on the effective purpose of such sacrificial violence in ancient communities. Quoting Girard, ultimately the persecutors always convince themselves that a small number of people, or even a single individual, despite his relative weakness, or in this case her relative weakness, is extremely harmful to the whole of society. Unquote. Under the guise of disciplining her, Fortune comes to realize that Mary Fortune was correct when she told him, nobody has ever beat me, and if anybody tries it, I'll kill him. After she whips Fortune, she is quick to emphasize that she is pure Pitts. This naming of herself as the other brings Fortune to his act of sacrifice. In doing so, however, he does not preserve his life, but rather loses it. By means of Fortune's death, O'Connor short-circuits the function of sacrificial violence as Girard defines its operation in ancient society. O'Connor's art was nurtured in the putatively modernist discourse she was instructed in by Alan Tate, Carolyn Gordon, the Iowa Writers' Workshop, and the Yaddo community. Part of modernism is the recuperation and revival of older traditions. Through both her modernist poetics and her Catholicism, she reaches back to an older legacy in this story, a legacy of parable. Gerard defines the Gospel's presentation of Christ's parables in a way that explains how O'Conner undermines the sacrificial system on which society is based. Quote, Jesus uses the resources of the system in such a way as to warn people of what awaits them in the only language they understand. By doing this, he reveals both the impending end of the system and the incoherence and internal contradiction of the discourse. He hopes to destroy the system in the minds of his listeners and at the same time to make them understand another meaning, truer to his words, but more difficult. Unquote. We may hear in this the echo of the message given to Tarwater at the end of The Violent Buried Away. Go warn the children of God of the terrible speed of mercy. This may also be a key to the final ending of the story we are considering, Fortune's terrible vision. I confess it has confounded me for years, but in his vision of the gaunt trees having, quote, thickened into mysterious dark files that were marching across the water and away into the distance, unquote, might we see there the Christ figure of the woods beating a hasty retreat from retributive justice, which Gerard perceives as part of Christ's sacrificial act? Despite the demystifying tendency of the psychoanalytic discourse, I now could be accused of having ultimately brought my interpretation of the story back to an orthodox reading of O'Connor's fiction. Yet, Gerard's thought, though ultimately as Catholic as O'Connor's own, presents us with a unique perspective on the operations of her fiction that is worthy of continued thought, study, and research. In her lecture, The Grotesque in Southern Fiction, O'Conner said, "The meaning of a story does not begin at a depth where adequate motivation and adequate psychology and various determinations have been exhausted. Such a writer will be interested in what we don't understand rather than what we do. He will be interested in characters who are forced out to meet evil and grace and who act on a trust beyond themselves, whether they know very clearly what it is they act upon or not." Sounds like psychoanalysis. Perhaps the full meaning of O'Connor's stories has been waiting on an equally idiosyncratic and prophetic theorist such as René Girard. For Girard allows us to preserve the insights of psychoanalysis as well as his own theories, as we can read its presence in O'Connor's fiction through Girard's continued engagement with the psychoanalytic discourse. In the end, all I present is nothing more than a sketch of what a full treatment of this theme might reveal.